correct?
Yes. Oh, we're live.
Hello, everybody.
Hello, hello. Welcome to Glenn from his different location.
Hello, Daryl. I'm
Hey.
closer in time zone to you now.
That's right, yes.
Although I almost had to do a hospital visit, in which case I wouldn't have been closer.
So you are now fully power enabled?
Oh, yes, I should probably show this. This has nothing to do with good API design or API-related questions, but I am at .NET Unboxed, and I realized as I started to, let's see.
No,
as
don't
we
see.
Hold on. Is it there yet?
No, I'm dizzy. Oh, there it is.
Okay. I realized as we started to record that I had no power, and there were no power outlets anywhere in sight. And then I scoped one, but the problem was it was up 8 feet. So I did a little bit of a MacGyver move, trying to figure out how to do it in such a way that I wouldn't have to do a hospital visit, which I think you saw from a distance what I did. Did it
Yes,
look like a hospital visit was imminent?
It was very impressive. We had every confidence in you, Glenn.
I fortunately found a cart that is of good metal quality that I was able to lean on to get the cord in. But we have full power now. So,
We will not be cut short.
moving on.
So we have been sort of avoiding the last couple of episodes. We've had a number of questions about Swagger, and we kind of circled around it a little bit last week, talking about auto-rest.
Yes.
Because Swagger is something that can drive auto-rest client generation. But currently our top voted question, with a rather sad number of votes of only 2, but we'll take it anyway, is what is our opinion of Swagger? And I think we should widen that a little bit, because we're not just talking about Swagger, we're talking about API description languages. So Swagger, RAML, Waddle.
Yes, it's a general discussion. Swagger is one implementation of.
Yeah. Okay, let's go through some of the very vague different, like Waddle was probably one of the first ones aimed at supporting HTTP APIs after we moved past our SOAP world of WSDL, because there is a comment in the question about how do we compare it with WSDL, and we'll get to that. So Waddle was kind of the first one produced by people at Sun, by a guy named Mark Hadley, I believe his name was, and it was an XML-based one, and it was a way of describing resources and describing the responses that would come back and the status code that might come back and so on and so forth. Swagger is one of the most popular. It's currently shepherded by SmartBear. A guy named Tony Tam has done a lot of the work on that, and Microsoft have adopted it quite a bit in their Azure infrastructure. It does seem to be winning the popularity battle, although I hear a lot of good things about another one called API Blueprint. Swagger is a JSON format, but there's also a YAML variant.
Yep. The three you hear the most about in this space lately are, you hear about Swagger, you hear about RAML from MuleSoft, and then you also hear quite a bit about API-Airy. I mean, one thing I think we could say is, so in terms of the general question about learning lessons from WSDL, I think we have. I mean, when, WSDL was all about basically using the web or as a RPC mechanism, a way to transport RPC calls from libraries, essentially. I think we've learned quite a bit. I mean, looking at all of the options that are kind of the primary options that are out there, I think we have learned about those pains. Now, each of the different options that are out there take different approaches, but at the end of the day, I think one thing we've learned from is that in the SOAP world, it was kind of like if you didn't rely on these tools, you kind of couldn't play in the game. So that was one big problem. I mean, it was all... I mean, it was possible, but it was very, very difficult. There were lots of clients that couldn't play, period, like browsers, because they just didn't have the stack that was necessary to be able to support, you weren't going to use a SOAP stack, for example. within a browser or running on a mobile device. It was possible, but it was not. It was not at all ideal.
In theory, you could, right? You can still an XHR request from within a browser.
You can send an XHR request, but having a full SOAP stack running like in a JavaScript client, for example, is not a. I mean, JavaScript itself is not really ideal for creating SOAP messages. You could do it, but
yeah. And I think you have to differentiate a little bit there. When you say SOAP stack, I think you could make requests and get responses back. It's when you started to layer on all the other WS star specifications with all of the reliable networking and the additional security stuff and all that. So that's where all of a sudden you couldn't get those benefits anymore.
Yeah.
So you're of the opinion that we have learned our lesson and we're not going to make the same mistakes again?
I wouldn't say we've completely. I wouldn't necessarily say that. And there are things that I see that are still evidently representative of the same kind of thinking. I think there has been a shift in the sense that one, there's a big move now to have as many clients as possible be able to access your API. That wasn't really a focus in the previous world, and it was difficult for many clients to play. So I think that's a place where we have learned a lesson. That ubiquity, making it so that any HTTP client anywhere, for example, is able to use your API, I think is something where there are still cases where that's not the case, but I think in general, when you build an API, the idea is you want to hit the broadest consumer as possible. So that's one place that I think we have learned.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here because I don't think we have learned. I think we're making the same mistakes as we did in the past, in that we're trying to use this API description language as a input to tooling to generate code-generated documentation quickly and to generate client code. And I think we are doing things in the name of making things easy and fast. We're creating huge amounts of coupling that defeats the purpose of what we're trying to do with HTTP. Now, having said that, I just want to add one caveat. I think you can use these API description languages in a way that doesn't do that. So I'm not dumping it all and saying API description languages are wrong. I'm just saying you can use them in the wrong way, and I'm seeing a lot of examples where I think we're doing the same thing with these new API description languages as we did do with WSDL.
Fair enough. Yeah, I still think there are some specific differences in the fact that all of the languages, all of the description languages at least are, I think they're focusing more on kind of resource and URI. Which is a shift. Now,
yes, it's resource oriented, right?
I mean, to a degree, right? Like you can still say, like we can talk about hypermedia and how does hypermedia fit in here, and that's a different question. I do think you're right. I mean, there is and I don't think that goal or that desire is going to go away. That people want to basically like be productive, and I agree with you that there are ways of utilizing these different formats in such a way that it will not repeat the lessons of, say, the WSDL world. And in the WSDL world, that wasn't really an option because WSDL was actually really built for a very specific thing, which was driving this auto generation and all the other things you mentioned in terms of different formats.
So I've been thinking a lot about this, and I kind of like, okay, well, what do I've been thinking, what would I recommend to somebody about using Swagger? And I have kind of any API description language. I have two kind of principles that I would stick to. And one is, if you auto-generate the API description language document from some implementation concept, like, for example, you can do that with Swashbuckle, you can generate Swagger, or I'm sure there's lots of other tools in other languages where you can generate the Swagger. If you do that, my recommendation is don't ever share that doc, that spec, with any team that doesn't share the same manager. Right? Don't share it outside of your walls, outside of your company. It's an integration doc that allows integration, but you need to be part of the same organization where you can make decisions about deployment and control so that you can synchronize the deployment of both ends of the wire. So that's, if you're auto-generating it, you need to keep very tight control over that spec, in my opinion.
I mean, so this gets to when you talk about what are the sins of the past, and one of the sins of the past was the fact that when you generated like clients, say, off of a WSDL, and then the server changed, those clients all broke. Right. I mean, that's the place where I think when a lot of us talk about the concerns we have with these new languages, and it certainly pops up the same thing, is like, am I now, and this is where I think you're hitting on with the kind of wolf in sheep's clothing, like, am I now in the same place where suddenly I have clients that are breaking because of the fact that, you know, something changed on the server?
Yeah. Now, it's not as bad as it used to be, right? Because WSDL did a few things. First of all, they used XML schema, and XML schema, if you weren't very careful, was extremely brittle. You changed anything in an XML document, and it got very upset. You changed the order of XML elements, you add a new XML element, the schema broke. And they encouraged versioning based on namespaces. So everything was really, really tightly contracted. In JSON and JSON schema, it's a lot looser. Like, you can add new resources into a Swagger document without updating the version. You have more responsibility for managing breaking changes, and therefore you get more flexibility. So it is better than it used to be. However, the other way of using these API description languages that I think I would rather people move towards is using them as a first-class source of truth. Like, fine, you don't want to define your API in terms of a particular implementation. I get that. So write a Swagger document by hand or with some design tool and make that your source of truth. And then I think then you can start to share that Swagger document.
Well, so, I mean, one of the companies that's been doing a lot of really interesting stuff around that is API-Airy.
Yes.
They've really pushed on, you know, a definition language that becomes that single source of truth that helps with the documentation efforts, and they've even gone so far as creating this tool called Dread. And what Dread will do is actually exactly what you said. It's going to make sure that your server is conformant to the spec, so to speak. So it's a really interesting idea. What Dread will do, it will take an API-Airy doc, and then it will actually formulate requests and verify that the server is actually behaving as it should when hit with requests that, you know, meet all the different criteria. So I think that's a really interesting one. And what you're saying there is that's a place where you could provide value even if you were not sharing it for any clients, just as a way of being like, because, okay, I'll use Splunk as an example, right? Today, we have hundreds of APIs on Splunk server, and we have different versions that get deployed into customer environments, and we run that in Splunk Cloud. And it's like a lot of times you want to like find out how this API works. Many times, unfortunately, it involves going to the code. You know, like we have the docs, but then the docs get stale, and we try to keep them updated, like everybody who's in this boat. So I've actually been quite interested in exploring the idea of us using something like API-Airy and saying, okay, well now this becomes a source of truth because we're a company that is building like hundreds of APIs. You know, it'd be great to have like a centralized source of truth, but then something that's even potentially executable to do those kind of automatic validations.
Yeah.
I mean, an interesting question in the topic of clients, though, is like when we talk about how there's proper ways to use it, is can you have like the best of both worlds? Like, can you have like auto-generated clients, for example, that won't be as brittle? Was one thing that, or you know, is that like one thing I saw that was really interesting that the API-Airy guys did is they basically built a hypermedia client, I forget what they called it, that ingests at runtime a API-Airy document, and it pulls in all of that metadata, and It works great with a dynamic language, because with dynamic language you can just manufacture things on the fly. I mean, of course, you can do that in almost any language now. Like you have lots of languages on JVM that support dynamic, and in the .NET world, for example, you have dynamic. But I thought it was a really interesting approach because it kind of reminded me of something early on. There was a Ruby project. I'm forgetting the name of it, but like 5 years ago when we were kind of talking all this REST stuff.
Yeah, I remember.
Restfully.
Restfully, that's right. Yeah.
But that had like a client that it would like auto-gen kind of thing.
Yeah.
But there it was all based on implementation. Like it wasn't the same model as there weren't these established documentation formats. So I find that one really interesting because at least in that model, it's all dynamic. It's even doing a lot of discovery at runtime in terms of the URIs and things like that. There's no code gen, but you have functionality that is, you're not having to craft it all yourself. And it is definitely using that document because it's populating a bunch of dictionaries and things like that simply based on directly consuming the doc. And what was cool in the demo is they showed making some significant changes. Like, for example, the doc actually had the location of the server where the API lived. So they were able to actually make changes to the doc, move to a different server. Suddenly, the client is completely immune, which is one of the beauties, I think, of hypermedia. So I think that's a really interesting approach. Another one that I was trying to explore, actually, when I was on the Web API team, was the idea of like having generated clients that still support evolvability, meaning so. You might still want to rev it later because you'll get more strongly typed stuff, but it doesn't break. And I think today
we touched on this a little last week, right?
Yeah, and I think you can do this. I still don't think, and maybe Daryl, you've I think done some more. And there's things like Traversin and JavaScript that help with some of this, but I think there's still a large portion of the world that likes to work in a strongly typed way. And so offering these dynamic alternatives, even like what I mentioned with the API guys, just doesn't satisfy them. So can we find a world that is in between both is an interesting question.
Yeah, definitely. Mark Foster and Stephen Mazel are some smart hypermedia guys doing some interesting stuff on their representer
pattern
over at API Array. There's some good stuff there. Yeah,
totally.
As I say, so these API description languages, you can derive all kinds of value from them. You just have to understand when you're using them, where you're introducing coupling, and what are the impacts of change. But I mean, that really isn't any different than any other architecture. It's just the downside is there's this lure of, look how easy we can make it. You just press this button and you automatically have documentation. Well, no, you automatically have documentation that says if you do get, you get a customer, and the path says /customer. Wow, that was really useful documentation. The problem is a lot of the times the really useful documentation is the stuff the human write. You don't need or that. And one of my fears is this. You write some useful documentation, but it's buried inside a large generated bunch of, get this to get that really doesn't add any value to, and just hides things. I mean, how many of us built libraries in .NET and use those automatic .chm generators, and you build it a few times and then nobody bothers ever reading it. There's a reason why developers don't read documentation, because they keep going to the documentation and getting lost in a whole bunch of useless stuff. So that's why they don't read it, right? Actually take the time and put the effort into documentation, and people will read the documentation you produce. So that's my only fear, is there's this kind of lure of, oh yeah, we can make it really easy if you buy this tooling. And there is no free lunch, I'm afraid.
I mean, so my big other concern with this whole thing, and this is where I think it has gotten a little better, is that, and I know we may not agree eye to eye, but my perception when I worked in the web services world was you kind of needed these you needed these frameworks and runtimes to play for a bunch of different reasons. That was the path that you were led down.
Yeah.
Tooling. You were led down a tooling path. in this world, and I had a big debate about this a while ago with API Array, with folks from API Array and RAML. I think it's like, if anything, these are an addition on top, but there's not, at least, we're not in a world where it's kind of like the only way you'll be able to work with an API is through having one of these, using one of these auto-generated tools. And I think that is quite a bit better. Like, it's like, you may have people that become dependent on them. Sure, there's a danger there, but still, fundamentally, like, because we're building these APIs over HTTP, and we're getting better, I think, at kind of using HTTP in the way it was intended to be used, though of course there's other movements against that. I think we're still better off than we were.
Pedro actually made an interesting comment in the chat, and he said he thinks the most useful documentation is the one he uses the word transversal, which is beyond my English language comprehension, but I think he's sort of saying orthogonal to the actual individual resources, and it applies across the API. And that's one interesting thing. As I've been playing around trying to build HTTP clients for different APIs, one of the things I will always find, even if they return application/JSON in every single endpoint, there is a structure that the API developer produces. Like some APIs, well, we'll start it with data at the root element, or we'll have a metadata. There's always some commonality that goes between the different resources in an API, and we don't tend to capture that commonality very much in the documentation that we produce. The one exception to that is like GitHub. GitHub actually explicitly went and created their own API, and although it's not very explicitly called out in the documentation, they do say, look, if there's a single item that we're returning, it's going to look like this. If there's a list of items, it's going to look like that. And it's those kind of conventions that you apply across your entire API that end up making it much easier to build client libraries to consume those APIs.
Well, and these are things like formats like collection.json are pushing on.
Right.
Coming up with a standard way that things are represented, and going beyond. Like, a lot of times when I compare something like, say, HAL between HAL and, let's say, collection.json, is that HAL provides a way for you to put links, and it's great, and I think it's like lowest hanging fruit of like, hey, we want to add hypermedia. HAL is pretty forgiving that you can kind of use anything. Yeah. But the problem that it's trying to solve kind of ends there. It doesn't really get into semantics of how you will use these things, and formats like collection.json and even like Uber, and this is a place also where, going back to how we mentioned Alps is trying to play in as well, is going further into thinking about different use cases for the API and Siren, all these different media types, and this goes back to the media type session. Okay, we should move on. Yeah, we just got a lot of time on.
Good plan. Okay, so, well, I guess we're getting questions in the order they were submitted. If you want your questions answered sooner, submit the question sooner. Tugberg says, what are the biggest security flaws on HTTP API designs and implementations you're seeing quite often? Glenn?
So one I'll mention is I see some people putting equivalent of authentication information into the URI. So token-based auth systems where they don't put the token as like a header, they actually put it in the URI of the query string. And this is problematic for a couple of reasons. Like, the servers that are out there on the internet have no visibility to authentication information that you plug into a URI. They actually do know how to deal with the authentication header, and there are special rules for that. There are lots of servers, for example, that if you have stuff in the URI, that will be logged. And so that means that information is potentially getting leaked, whereas if that information is in a header, those servers know how to deal with that. It's very explicit. So that's just one I wanted to mention.
Yeah. I think another thing that's key is making sure that if you have tokens, that they are revocable on the server side. Just in case, tokens get leaked, you want the ability to be able to revoke particular tokens and reissue new ones.
And the reissue is another important one. So I just recently worked on a capability that we added into Splunk, which is token-based, and we absolutely have the ability to to basically like expire a token. You could expire one or revoke it. But what we didn't have was an easy way to reissue. And what that means is often tokens have other metadata associated with them that may be in the system that issued them. And that was the case with us for our event collector for Splunk. We have tokens, but those tokens have other kinds of metadata associated with them. So while we gave you an ability to expire them or to revoke them, you then had to create a new token using the similar metadata. And we ultimately now have fixed that. We've added a cycle. And what cycle does is basically say, okay, this is all on the back end. You know, we have an API where as long as you're authenticated, you could go and say, cycle this particular token. So it's the same metadata. It's just a new GUID that gets generated.
I saw something interesting on the Azure Service Bus. They had, and API management does the same thing. They have a primary and a secondary key.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea being that at some point you take the primary one, you move it into the secondary, and you issue a new primary one. Both are valid, but it allows you to regularly change the token, but you still support the old one until it expires, which I thought was an interesting.
That's a good idea. That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Cool.
I mean, other security things is like I don't see a whole lot of encrypting of payloads. It's something that you can do fairly easily with
supporting HTTPS.
content. Well, you can do HTTPS, right? But
the transport.
Even
you're talking about not transport level. You're talking about actually at the payload level.
Yeah, payload level. Encoding it and then sending it over the wire and then decoding it on the other end. All the libraries out there have tools for doing that kind of thing. I'm surprised we don't see more of it.
Yeah, I think one of the problems though is like when you think about mobile devices, for example, and like applications running in browsers on mobile devices, every cycle costs. And so, you know, you're using HTTPS, which is encrypting the transport, and then you're also using some encryption of the payload. That actually, battery life actually does matter in a mobile world.
Yeah, you know what? The cynic in me says there's so much more optimization that could be going on in some of these mobile apps. These mobile phones have quad and now, 8-core CPUs in them. I'm not convinced that the additional load of putting a few encrypted payloads when you're probably also retrieving half a dozen ads for your app at the same time.
I think it gets to a more fundamental question though. Like you're saying, yes, browsers can support it, but when people have looked at like why go SOAP versus like you know, an HTTP API, one big vector was actually encryption. That people always talk about. Like if you need encryption, that is a big thing that SOAP tried to solve. You know, so I think there's a question about the friendliness to clients of the web, right? If you stick to kind of the core HTTP basics, and I'll include HTTPS in that because it's fairly fundamental, you can get a pretty far way without having to introduce these things. Once you add these extra complexities, like can I curl it anymore, for example? I mean,
you could still curl it, just comes back as an ugly blob, right?
Exactly, which is useless to me. So I think it's like I kind of, you know, and I think this is going to happen on this show that we'll not always agree, but I actually would not like to see encryption of API payloads. So that's Glenn's vote that we do not do this. That's okay that we don't necessarily see eye to eye.
That's fine. Yeah, I'm sorry, Tugboat, we couldn't give you a whole lot of information there.
I want to have another one is just using HTTPS. Yeah. There's a lot, you know, there's a lot, you know, HTTP, I mean, HTTPS is a, you know, of course, we've had our issues with SSL, which are the server implementations of it, but HTTPS is usually very easy. Most stacks will support it, and you know, it does give you some guarantees, some good guarantees. You usually don't have to pay a lot to be able to use it. Another one I think is, you know, not supporting something like HTTPS Basic, which is, you know, also very prevalent authentication model that a lot of systems understand. So that's, you know, that's a challenge. We see APIs out there that don't basically embrace the standard authentication models that are available.
Yeah, yeah. But you know, this isn't really a security podcast, and neither of us are security experts, right? So we should be careful the guidance and advice that we give. Oh, something froze. Glenn froze. So I'm okay. Okay, well, I've just been told by our delightful moderator, Sean, who's controlling the things in the background, that I'm still alive. So I will continue on until Glenn manages to get back. Let's go back to the next question. Hey, I can answer all these questions without getting anybody telling me I'm wrong. Oh, he's back. Damn. Okay. Hey, Glenn.
Hello.
Yeah, so I don't know whether you caught the last thing that I said. Basically, you know, we're not really security experts, so we should probably be careful what we say about security.
That is a good point.
So, moving on to the next question.
Okay. Highly depends on the business needs and domain specifics, I assume, but is there any advantage of giving back a 410 rather than a 404 whenever that is possible? Have you seen any good usage of 410 so far rather than suicidal blogs? I'm going to let you take this one. And Tugberg, you should probably get like an award or something because you've asked us so many questions today, and we appreciate that.
Okay, so just to mention that the suicidal blog reference, I believe that was Mark Pilgrim from Google, who he did a 410 on his blog when he decided to shut all of his stuff down and take his Python book with him. So 410, it means gone, right? It means the resource is no longer available. The semantic difference between a 410 and a 404 is that a 410 is intended to be a permanent thing, and a 404 means it might come back, it might never have been there. It's very vague. It doesn't really tell you anything, but it's potentially a temporary status. There might be something there at some point in the future. The downside to 410 is that you actually have to keep track on your server of all the resources that did exist once upon a time and that you have since deleted so that you know to return a 410. So you're increasing the effort that your server has to do. Now, I mean, there's some things you could do. Let's say you do a soft delete type thing where you don't actually delete it, and you just do a soft delete. Then okay, it's fairly easy to implement a soft 10. A soft 410 response. As far as real significant value, I'm at a loss. I believe one of the specs, it'll be RFC 7231 that would talk about 410. It may have some additional information about why it's useful. To be honest, I've never actually used it myself.
Yeah, totally useless to me. I've never seen it used, and I would probably return a status code saying that I'm a teapot before I would return 410.
Okay,
anyway.
So here's the scenario. Let's say there is a transition between the online world and the physical world. I don't know, you're sending a request to print out a license plate, and for some reason you don't want to physically keep certain records. You might want, if somebody requests, oh, I'd like this vanity license plate, you might return, no, that's gone, it's already been taken. Because now you've actually, something physically exists in the real world that corresponds to that URI. I don't know.
I mean, the only one I could think of is where the message. So 404, you really don't know what it means. It could be that server's just down, there's a network issue, there's a bunch of different things. Whereas 410 is certainly very explicit. I'm not here. I don't exist anymore. I was here at one point. I'm not there now. Now, one place I could see of doing this, but it probably wouldn't make sense from a cost-effectiveness perspective, is like, let's say I had a service that was up and that service is no longer exists and it was taken down. I could but I probably wouldn't want to do that if it meant I was going to have to pay recurring bills because my startup went out of business. I don't want to be paying additional. But I mean, I guess if you had a scenario though where
we're out of business and bankrupt, but
exactly,
somehow we're still paying.
Right. We've done a GoFundMe or a GoFund my 410 message
Yeah.
continuing.
I
But
mean, it tells somebody that they didn't make a typo, potentially, right? It's a case-sensitive URL, and they accidentally used the wrong casing. I mean, there's maybe some scenarios
because
around
a
that,
lot of the
but
instances where I would imagine this, I would probably think more of something like, what is it, a 304 or a 303, one of the redirect family would be a common case where, hey, it's no longer here, but it's over here,
yeah.
versus the no longer here, not coming back. Now, I guess another possible use case, but I think it's a pretty, I mean, I've never ran into it, not to say that I've looked at every API that exists, but a different use case might be like, we're a company, we had a service that we shut down, but the company's still going. We just want to kind of let you know this service is actually down. It's not a 404. It's not like it's temporary. It's gone. Maybe then. But that all being said, this is all just hypotheticals because I've never actually seen it used in the real world. I was hoping, Daryl, you were going to tell me a real-world use case where you've seen it. And if you haven't seen it, well, now we'll have to go ask Mike and see if Mike has seen 410. So Mike Amundsen, if you're listening, we're coming after you. We want to know what servers you've seen that return status.
We could do a query on HTTP Archive and see if we can find any responses that actually exist out there that are at 410 gone.
Maybe you'll get a 410 when you do that, when you go to the...
Okay. Jonathan. Well, we have two, but I think we could probably only fit one in. Okay, so I have an API that needs to scale. I can add HTTP caches and load balancers. Will using a message bus on the server help? Well, Jonathan asked me this question on Twitter.
Yeah, to me,
I returned him it depends.
Seems like a big. It depends. Right, without knowing more detail, I don't think that a message bus is going to be the magic solution. I definitely don't think that. A solution that incorporates a message bus might help, might not be necessary. Without knowing more information, I can't really answer.
Yeah.
So maybe we can go to the next one.
Well, let me make a half-assed attempt at saying something useful on this. The thing about a message bus, right, is it a fire and forget message or is it a request response message? If it's a fire and forget, well, yeah, we can map that to a 202. If it's a request response, then well, really, what are we adding? I mean, maybe we're affecting something about the load in the back end. But I mean, there are web frameworks that allow requests to be handled asynchronously, so that we're not holding up, connections. So that kind of gives you that same kind of. I guess the answer is we'd really need to know why somebody would want to use a message bus, and then we could debate whether or not there's value. But again, this is a show about HTTP. We stop right at the interface. What you do behind that interface, yeah, it's completely up to you.
Now, I think what you could say is there are things you could do which you started to hit on, like using resources, building out resources in a way that better supports asynchrony. And this is very much also baked into even the notion of HTTP, like the concept of accepted. You go to do a post and there's some work that needs to get done, and it says very clearly in the HTTP spec the notion of a status monitor. So you can basically have standard people return a 201. You go to do a post, you get back a 201 that says the resource has been created. But what if there's, well, first off, nothing about post enforces creation,
right?
And
yes.
The updated specs, they finally are clarifying that there is no implied parent-child relationship or anything like that. Post is just a way to do stuff. One of the things it could do is create a resource, but it doesn't have to. And if it creates a resource, it can return a 201. But if it's going to do some work at some point in the future, it can actually return a 202. And when it returns a 202, that 202 is saying that I've accepted this request that you've sent me. It looks valid. I've accepted it. But I'm not actually creating any resource now. But it can then return to you a content location header, which points to a resource. Now, that resource that it points to could be the resource that will get created, but it doesn't have to be. And if you read the spec, it's pretty clear on the fact that this resource could actually be a monitoring endpoint that you would poll continually to find out where this other resource, if it gets created, is going to live. And then it could return back that. And you go even further to say that it doesn't even have to be that a resource was created per se. It could be that there's a status monitor there that's just going to return to you some type of representation that states the status of the work it was doing versus some type of what you would think of as some type of persistent resource. So now there has been some interesting work around asynchrony. There's been some proposal. Is it deferred? There was some type of headers that I saw floating around that were trying to kind of take asynchrony and elevate it more.
Well, the really nice header is the prefer header, right? The prefer header, one of the parameters.
Which prefer?
Oh, please,
okay.
Yeah, so prefer header is a way of a client expressing a preference for how the server actually performs the operation. And one of the options you have on the prefer header is asking for something to be done async. So a client can walk up to an endpoint and go, yeah, could you do that for me? But you know what? I'm not going to wait around for you to do it. I'm going to come back later and check and see and get the result. Or you can say, no, I want you to do this sync, and just say, okay, I'll wait till you're done. Right?
And that's useful. And that's useful in particular, like if you're dealing with even like legacy systems that know how to just take a URI. There's a lot of, as we've moved into say like this webhooks world, you see lots of systems that say, hey, I'm URI aware. Give me a URI, I'll pull it on some interval, or I'll do a post to it, whatever. And those clients may not support that asynchronous paradigm, so they can prefer, gives them the ability to basically take control of that.
But that's a really nice thing if you build a resource and then you say, well, it could be async or it could not be async, depending on what your particular scenario is. Maybe you want to run a bunch of things across a whole bunch of different resources and they're all async. You just fire them all off and wait for them to all finish. Or it could be specifically, it's an interactive, a human pressing a button, and you want to sit there and wait until they actually get the result back before. So that's really cool. Thanks, Jonathan, for talking about Message Bus so that we could turn the conversation around and talk about 202 accepted. Okay, so I think we can squeeze in a little conversation on the last question. The question actually I think was triggered based on a little conversation that happened on Twitter, and I saw some conversation going on about JSON and REST, and I tweeted that what was it I said? I said REST is to JSON as healthy eating is to lettuce. Because lettuce is awesome. It's fabulous. Healthy. You can do all kinds of things with it, and it is a good part of a healthy eating. But they're not the same things. They don't kind of go side to side.
Well, I mean, I think an important thing to say there too with this particular one is the fact that JSON is a wire protocol format. There can be many different media types that all support JSON, and there are now that have sprung up. So let's just look at just the JSON world. Let's forget about PDF. Let's forget about Atom. Let's forget about all of that. Let's just look at the tons of media types that have now appeared and which different clients may have support for that are maybe trying. I mean, they all have different semantics, but they're all layered on top of JSON, right? So you have HAL plus JSON. We talked about that. That has limited, but you might have a HAL client that knows how to navigate HAL. And then you have collection plus JSON, which gives you collection semantics. It's JSON under the, at the lowest levels of the plumbing, but it's layering different semantics on top of it. And then you have Siren, and the list goes on. So, and it's very plausible that I might have a server that supports multiple of these, especially if there are different semantics that can be leveraged from those different media types. So my point on that is you can totally imagine a world of content negotiation even if all those things were just JSON, and giving clients that ability to choose between the different variants of formats that live on top of JSON.
Which leads into the rest of Massimiliano, I'm going to butcher your name, I'm afraid, Massimiliano. The rest of his question, which is, let's talk about content negotiation, right? Why do we want to content negotiate? I mean, my perspective there is, as you said, to support different clients for different perspective. It's not about whether, oh, well, I think, curly braces go faster over the wire than angle brackets. It's about we're delivering to a browser, and a browser has a JavaScript interpreter, therefore sending JSON is a very natural thing to do. Yeah. And we have this tendency to kind of fad on formats and move from one to the other, and we shouldn't throw away perfectly good formats for clients that have good support for them. But if you are talking to a browser or you're talking to a Node.js client, then JavaScript JSON makes an absolute ton of sense. It also makes a lot of sense for something that just needs a simple format to go over the wire, because it is a really nice format over the wire. It's a less nice format for storing stuff. And that brings another issue of, like, we have this habit of assuming that the same format that goes over the wire is the same format that we should store. And I think we need to kind of break that because they are two very different scenarios. But going back to content negotiation.
What goes across the wire, I like to think a lot about the fact that what goes across the wire is a client-centric view. Like, it should really be focused on the needs of the client. And you should not ideally push the needs of the server to the client. And so I think that is a big thing that would help a lot of APIs if you really focus on, hey, this API is there to serve the client. What does the client need to get its task done, rather than the optimizing on what would make life for the server easier.
Yeah. So just to talk a little bit more about content negotiation, because I think the opinion of my opinion of when and where to use it has changed, and I think the first thing to recognize is that there are different types of content negotiation. There is what they call the transparent or server-driven content negotiation, where you send an accept header with some preferences, and the server decides what format of response to return. There's the other, which is the client-driven, where the client asks for a particular resource, and the server says, oh, well, I have these different variants. That's what a 300 response status code is for, multiple choices. Yes. Unfortunately, it doesn't get used very much because there isn't really a standardized payload format for a 300 response header. I know a lot of people have talked about using link headers with rel alternate, and you may have seen rel alternate in HTML pages, right? You go to a web page, you get HTML back, and included in there is a link that points to RSS, right?
And the reason why people push back on it is this idea of this magic algorithm. Like, there's limitations, first of all, in what the client can actually express. It's not an explicit model, whereas if you go with the agent-driven negotiation, it actually is a very explicit model. The server is explicitly saying, here's what I have to offer. The client has the logic of the choosing, rather than offloading that to the server and then the client. I mean, then you can use things like the vary header to try to communicate it. But you're right. It is the one that many of the frameworks that have adopted content negotiation have bought into.
Yeah. And the downside to doing transparent content negotiation is they have the same URI. So as soon as you get into caching, the cache has to work really hard because you have to use the vary header to differentiate. So I think there's a lot less enthusiasm for using transparent content negotiation these days as maybe there once was. And I really don't think there's a big deal in creating different resources. The whole .xml and .json on the end is a perfectly valid way to go. So and with
don't watch a lot of my earlier talks and demos from when I was on the Web API team.
look, we built that into Web API as supporting content negotiation, and it is an important step to bring awareness of that concept into a certain ecosystem. But you learn things a certain way, and then as you get more experience with them, you refine your opinions on some of these things. So.
Exactly, unless you're dogmatic. If you're dogmatic, you don't change your opinions. But yeah, don't be afraid to change your opinions as we learn more. Okay, I think
Okay.
that wraps it up.
There's another one, but we will save that for next week, and hopefully we will get more questions next week. And as long as people keep enjoying us doing this blathering, we will continue doing it.
Yes, and we'd still love your feedback. Like, I know we spent like 20 minutes on one question, which I told Daryl at the beginning when we first saw that question. I'm like, this one's going to be a pretty long answer, but let us know if you want us to be, more refined, or if you feel like we're spending too much time pontificating, debating, whatever the case may be. We're happy to adjust, and we're just really appreciative that you guys joined us.
Thank you very much, and we'll see you again next week.
Next week.